Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. It says it's sharing, which is awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here as part of the Standout. Brilliant initiative and great events taking place. So I'm going to be looking at the 7 common mistakes to avoid in marketing, and you'll see both by my background and on my slides. I've actually published a book in May all about this, all about overcoming 10 common pitfalls. So I'm going to go through 7 of those today. And as I was introduced there, for anyone who asks any questions during this live event, there will be free copies of my book available as well. So do ask your questions, and then you can get a free copy of my new book. Okay, so what are those 7 common pitfalls? Before I run through those, just a very quick introduction about my company and what we do. So I run a marketing agency called Let's Talk Strategy. We're based both in the UK and in Europe, in Portugal, in Lisbon. And we work with a huge variety of brands and organisations. We're also members of the CIM. I'm a chartered marketeer, and we work very closely with the DMA in the UK as well. Okay, so the first common mistake to avoid, and probably won't be a surprise that I'm mentioning this one, considering my background's heavily in strategy, but it is actually having a strategy-free strategy. And it's amazing how many times I come across this in a number of different organizations where the focus is heavily made on the tactics and not so much actually thinking about, okay, what do we want to achieve? And why do we want to achieve that? And defining that strategy. And that doesn't have to be a really lengthy, boring process. I think that's what tends to put a lot of people off. But it's really important to have that initial foundation in place to make sure that what you're doing is actually going to be useful and efficient for your organization, but of your company. So what is strategy? Strategy is the who, what, where, when, and why. And this is what you need to determine in your strategy. And the tactics are the how you are going to achieve that strategy. And it's really difficult to determine the correct tactics to use if you haven't determined that strategy. So do try to take, even if it's just 5 minutes, to just think about who, what, where, when, and why are we trying to achieve in our strategy, and then think about those tactics. I've tried to do this in a simpler format because I didn't feel that there was really a template to go with for defining your strategy. And in my book, I've broken down the word strategy and broken it down into those key steps to follow to avoid this pitfall of having a strategy-free strategy. So the first one is scenario, making sure that you have your scenario in place. And I'm going to run through exactly what should go in there, but really business and what you're trying to achieve. And then defining that within your target, your objectives. And I have a few examples to share with you of both good and bad objectives. Your reach, so who is your audience? Where are you? How are you going to attract them? Where are they? And really focusing on how you're going to drive awareness of your organization, your product, your service, and how you're going to do that. Are your tactics, so which ones are you going to implement? And you can see here the danger that we fall into as marketers, where we miss all of these stages and go straight to tactics. We've already missed quite a lot of information to gather. Then execution, so how are you going to execute your tactics? How are you going to implement them? How are you going to generate those results, and how are you going to report on them? What do those metrics need to look like? And what is that yield? What's the overall response? What have you learnt, and what can you take with you for your next campaign? And I'm going to be running through each of these stages with examples for each part as well to show you what this looks like in reality. So there are 3 frameworks to start with the scenario, and when you're thinking about your strategy, that is the Swot and Pestle. I'm sure you've heard a lot about these already. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in your SWOT. In your Pestle, thinking about that external environment. Now I've brought these both together and pulled them together to create a SWOT out to actually enhance the traditional SWOT. Thinking about what your existing structure looks like, and maybe there's some elements in there that could be improved upon, or you've got, existing great resources in place. What are your limitations? Maybe it's the structure of your team, and what can you leverage? What can you make more of? And really thinking about this for your SWOT so it becomes more action-based. You might identify some really clear gaps, or actually some really good opportunities that you could leverage because you have those resources in place. And on a flip side, it might be that actually you can't achieve those objectives because of those limitations that you have. So it helps you to have that conversation at board level with directors, and maybe there's an area that you need to focus on improving moving forward. So moving on to the next pitfall, really thinking about that communication part as well of your strategy is really important. And this is James Dowles from the CIM. Thinking about how you're going to get that buy-in from stakeholders and that communication piece of your strategy is a key area to really think about as well. And also thinking about your audience. So when we're thinking about communication and the strategy, and if we just go after tactics, it can be read in completely the wrong way. And Burger King was a prime example of that back in March, where they talked about women belonging in the kitchen was their initial tweet, and there's a whole thread of research. And actually the underlying message was a good one of what they were trying to portray, but that initial attention-grabbing tweet here, read on its own, out of context, doesn't necessarily come across particularly well to their audience. So do think about that when we're going straight after those tactics. Okay, the next pitfall is objectives. Vague objectives is something I see a lot of very often, and maybe you actually feel like you're working towards those vague objectives at the moment. Try to include at least one KPI in your objectives, and be realistic with your objectives. Really think about if you can achieve them, and that's what that SWOT is to help make sure that you create those realistic objectives. So I've broken down how to create objectives. It's an enhancement on SMART called Scale, and really trying to make sure that you think about the key areas here when defining those targets. And it might be that you already have targets in place that you can use this model to critique and see whether or not it actually does fit these areas. So starting with strategic, why are these objectives being set? What is the desired ambition to achieve from the business? Thinking about considered, what are those business objectives and goals? And how are marketing objectives contributing to that? The audience, so who are you hoping to engage, and be as specific as possible here. Lift, what was your overall numerical performance target? What are you trying to get to? And what is the end date for achieving that objective? So here you'll see there's a big focus on your audience, as typically we think about objectives for the business and not necessarily thinking about what. Some examples of good objectives. So increase the customer lifetime value of our email subscribers, increase our deliverability rate to Gmail subscribers to 90%. And by the end of 2020, this was actually a client example from last year. So the first area you can see here, there's a clear main cause that's been developed. Oh, sped through there. I'm on a timing here, so I need to speed up a little bit. Bad objectives, increase revenue from email. So it may be possible to increase the revenue, but the context, clear KPIs and the time frame are missing here. If this is just your objective, this is a pretty tricky one. You can see here how that could be rephrased. So increase email revenue from 20% to 25% in 12 months from our highly engaged subscribers. And that's how you can enhance a bad objective. We just go back because I realized we skimmed very quickly over the good. So the first action has clearly identified the main cause. The second one identifies the potential issue, and that gives you an area to investigate where you might have potential challenge. So you see how your objectives gives you clear direction, and that's what we should be focusing on, rather than thinking about, okay, we just need to increase revenue from email. How we can enhance that massively by including a KPI and some content. Not knowing your customer. I think the Super League was one of the greatest examples of this. Launching the Super League and then completely backtracking, demonstrating that the chairmen of the clubs, football clubs, didn't really think about the fans and the response of the fans, but also have a completely different perception than the fans of the football clubs themselves. So this was really quite an eye-opener, I think, and it demonstrates the importance of knowing your customer. So this example here from Michelle Gettins from Tommy Tippy talks through really thinking about those needs and wants and desires of their customers to make parents' lives easier. And that's their clear key focus at Tommy Tippy. So you see here how they've really identified who their customers are. There are loads of tools available. It's just a snapshot here. This is recorded, so you'll be able to come back to the slide where there's lots of different tools available to be able to find out more about your customer. Spotify. So being really clear in what you do and trying not to muddy that water. Spotify is really clear on what they do. They provide music. You can stream it online. Simple. They haven't tried to deviate away from that core existence of what they do as a business. Really clear to the customer what they do. And when we think about customer personas, and this is an example from Action for Children, we've got the likes here of what they really, really like. So they can then target those donators with that content that's going to be engaging to them. And that's really important so they can drive those additional donations. I've got a brilliant case study. Lots of detail was provided in the book about how they did this and used this for marketing. When we think about the product life cycle and how this goes through different changes based on the changes in customer needs and wants, Lucozade is a brilliant example. Started as a glucose drink for children, have gone into being a sports drink and now into a healthy drink. And the sports drink was originally seen now to be too sugary, and they've amended that. And this is looking at that augmented product. A brilliant model to check out if you haven't seen this before. It has 3 core layers. You've got your core product, the actual product, and then the augmented product. And there's lots of different additions to add to your product here, all focused on the customer. Really useful exercise for any business, new or old. Okay, pitfall 4 is tactics. Tactics are defined both for the strategy. As I said at the beginning, I see this quite very often. You might find that you are forced to do this sometimes within your marketing position. So do really think about those different steps in the breakdown of the word strategy. The tactics. We have the Aidl model, and I've included an addition to this one in my book. We're starting with education at the top to take into account organisations that are brand new. But always keep coming back to this, where you've got that education piece, you've got the awareness, interest, desire, action, and driving loyalty. If we went into action all the time, driving those actions and conversions, and we miss all of these other stages in the model. Pitfall 5, and this I see all the time, and maybe you do as well, it's inconsistency. Huge amount of inconsistency takes place across lots of different channels, messaging, any forms here. One way to really stop this is to think about your brand guidelines. Here's an example of my company's. It's a one-pager, really simple, available to share to all event and organisers. Really think about what your branding looks like, and if it is straightforward and easy to use. I've worked with some companies and they had 20 variations of their brand guidelines. 20. Huge number, and had all of the colours available in the rainbow to use. And that creates inconsistency because then there's too much personal interpretation. Pitfall 6, measuring everything. Trying to measure every single metric, every single piece of performance is not only exhausting and impossible, but also means that you lose your focus. So define your benchmark, set non-subjective KPIs to measure your performance. Think about consistency here as well. So if you've changed how you measure something the previous year, you need to make sure that you take that into account for the next year, and making sure that it aligns to your objectives. And this is where having that KPI in your objectives is really useful to then be able to measure your performance. Pitfall 7. Undefined KPIs is also a key area. So hopefully you've defined these in your objectives, and you have these now in your measurements. So you should avoid this pitfall and common mistake. There are lots of KPIs available, and a really key one is customer lifetime value, CLTV. So over the lifetime of that customer being with you and purchasing with you, what does that value look like? We then have cost per acquisition, CPA. Really think about how much it costs to acquire a customer. This is always really interesting to look at from an email marketing perspective, from a sign up in comparison to your paid advertising organizations. How long does it take to close a deal? Because you'll need to think about that in your forecasting. Your customer retention rate, how many customers are you keeping? And what does that rate look like? Maybe it's going up and down if you look at a comparison. So that's an absolute whistle-stop tour of breaking down strategy and those 7 common pitfalls. So here we've got the breakdown. We're looking at scenario. That's that starting piece where we look at the Swot and Pestle and the SWOT. We then have target. What is that desired destination and ambition? We then have reach. What is the appropriate route to take to attract and engage your customer? Then we have the awareness, how you're planning to drive that awareness to your target customer. Tactics, which you see come in here much later down in the process. What tactics are you going to use and how are they going to be used? Execute, so how will the strategy be executed? What resources, skills and tools do you need to be able to do that? Generate, how are you going to track marketing performance, measure results and think about that response? And that might be something that you do on a weekly, quarterly basis, not necessarily at the very end of a campaign. And yield, what are those KPIs that you will use? What learnings will you take to improve and inform the next marketing campaign? As I mentioned in my book, I actually have 10 common pitfalls that have been identified, lots of quotes, case studies, insights from other marketers, business owners and entrepreneurs have all inputted into what they see to be those common pitfalls and how to avoid them, including lots of examples of real life scenarios that I faced as well working with other businesses. So as I mentioned at the start, there's an option for all attendees to not only get a discount to buy the book, but actually I have free books available to give to anybody who has any questions from the session today or would like to run through anything. I think we have a little bit of time.